He bought the saloon girl's freedom for 10 and a mule, then vanished before she could say his real name. The smoke hung in the saloon like morning fog over a graveyard, thick and unmoving, catching the yellow light from the oil lamps until everything took on the color of old photographs. Sarah pressed herself against the rough pine wall near the door, her fingers worrying the frayed edge of her shawl, watching the stranger in the corner count his money with the reverence of a man handling communion wafers. 10 silver dollars. She'd counted them with him, silently, as his cracked thumbs pushed each coin across the scarred table. $10 that caught the light and threw it back like accusations. Behind him, the other men played their cards and told their lies, but he sat apart from their noise, an island of stillness in that sea of smoke and whiskey breath. The deed lay between his hands and Colton's, a piece of paper that might as well have been written in blood for all the life it was about to drain from him. Sarah knew what it meant. Everyone in Perdition knew. A man's mule was his legs in this country. Without it, he was just another ghost waiting to happen, another set of bones for the desert to claim. Colton's fat fingers drummed against the table, impatient as a vulture. Well, his voice cut through the laughter like a rusty blade. We doing this or not, old man? The stranger's hands stilled. Sarah saw them clearly now, hands that had known rope and leather, sun and soil. Hands that had built things, maybe loved things, certainly. The right one trembled slightly as it rested on the deed, and she wondered if it was age or something else that made it shake. Her name's Rosalie, the stranger said, and his voice was like wine through dry grass. She's particular about her oats. Won't eat them if they're dusty. And she spooks at thunder, but if you sing to her, he stopped, swallowed something that might have been pride or sorrow or both. She's a good mule. Colton snorted. I ain't running no singing school for livestock. He pushed the $10 forward with one finger, like there was something distasteful. Take your money, old man. I got buyers waiting in Tucson. The stranger's eyes, pale blue, like sky reflected in still water, moved from the coins to the deed, then to something beyond both that only he could see. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for something she couldn't name. The saloon noise faded until all she could hear was the slow tick of the clock on the wall and the whisper of paper as he finally slid the deed across the table. There's a place, he said, so quiet she almost missed it, about 3 miles north where the creek bends. She likes to drink there in the evening. The water's sweet. Colton was already folding the deed, stuffing it into his vest pocket with all the ceremony of a man pocketing a grocery list. But the stranger wasn't watching him anymore. His gaze had turned inward, seeing things that weren't in that smoky room. Maybe a mule drinking at a creek bend, maybe something else entirely that $10 couldn't begin to pay for. Sarah wanted to look away, but couldn't. There was something terrible and holy about watching a man sell the last piece of himself, something that made her think of Abraham and Isaac, of sacrifices demanded and prices paid. The stranger gathered the coins slowly, each one a small weight in his palm, and she saw his lips move in what might have been a count or might have been a prayer. When he stood, he moved like a man walking away from a grave. The coins disappeared into his coat pocket, but his hand lingered there, feeling their shape through the worn fabric. He didn't look at Colton again, didn't look at anyone really, just moved toward the door with the careful steps of someone learning to walk without something essential. Sarah stepped aside to let him pass, and for a moment they were close enough that she could smell the dust on his clothes, the leather and sweat, and something else, the scent of ending things. His eyes met hers briefly, and she saw in them a depth of loss that made her chest tight. Then he was past her, pushing through the saloon doors into the darkness beyond. The doors swung shut behind him with a sound like a coffin closing. Sarah stood there, still pressed against the wall, still watching the empty space where he'd been. Around her, the saloon life resumed its noisy course. Cards shuffling, glasses clinking, men lying about women and gold and tomorrow. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed something sacred, something that deserved more than the indifference of a Tuesday night in Perdition. Hey, girl. Colton's voice made her flinch. You planning on earning your keep tonight? Or you just going to stand there mooning? She turned away from the door, from the darkness where the stranger had disappeared and moved back into the smoke and noise. But as she served whiskey to men who'd forgotten how to taste it, as she smiled at jokes that weren't funny, she kept thinking about those 10 silver dollars and what they bought. Not a mule, she realized. Something else. Something a man needed more than transportation in a land that killed the walking. Later, much later, when the saloon had emptied and she was alone with the guttering lamps and the smell of spilled beer, she found herself at the corner table where the transaction had taken place. There was nothing there now but scratches in the wood and a small water stain where a glass had sat. But she could still see his hands counting out those coins, still hear his voice saying a mule's name like it was a daughter's. She never learned his name. In a town full of forgotten men, he was just another ghost passing through. But she remembered the weight in his eyes as he'd counted out the price of his survival, and she wondered, as she would wonder for years to come, what he planned to buy with 10 silver dollars that was worth more than tomorrow. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying dust and distance and the sound of something that might have been singing. The morning came to perdition like a cautious visitor, painting the sky the color of old roses and ash. Sarah stood in the doorway of Madame Lucille's establishment, her few possessions bundled in a flour sack, watching the light creep down the empty street like spilled honey. 10 silver dollars weighted her pocket, the exact price of her contract, pressed into Lucille's palm just hours ago, while the woman slept off her laudanum dreams. She'd searched for him through what remained of the night, that nameless man who'd sold his mule and pressed the coins into her hand with trembling fingers. His words still echoed in the hollow spaces of her chest. Some chains need breaking more than others. But the boarding houses knew no such guest, and the night watchman had seen only shadows. The stable sat at the town's edge like a prayer chapel, its weathered boards silver in the growing light. Samuel, the colored man who kept the horses, was already at work, his movements careful and practiced as he forked hay into the stalls. He looked up at her approach, and she saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Everyone knew Lucille's girls, even the ones who tried to disappear. "Morning, Miss Sarah." His voice carried the softness of men who spent their lives speaking to animals. "You're about early." She pulled her shawl tighter, though the morning held no chill. "I'm looking for someone." A man, older, with hands that shake. He would have come for his mule. Samuel's face shifted, something like understanding settling into the lines around his mouth. He set down his pitchfork with the care of a man laying down arms. "You mean the one who sold Rosalie to Colton? He was here before the stars faded. Paid for a horse with paper money. Said he had business west. Did he say anything else?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, carrying more weight than words should hold. "Only asked me to water the trough fresh. Particular about it, he was." Samuel's eyes moved past her to the wooden trough near the entrance. Said sometimes folks leave things for finding. Her heart stumbled over itself as she moved to the trough, her shadow falling across the still water. There, wedged beneath the weathered wood where only searching hands would find it, was a piece of paper folded small as a secret. Her fingers shook as she pulled it free, the paper soft with handling, like it had lived in a pocket close to skin. The writing was careful, the letters formed by someone who'd learned them late and treasured them more for the learning. "Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be past Eagle Rock. A man named Marcus owns a boarding house in Santa Fe. He owes me a favor from the war. This paper's enough to collect it. There's work there for women who want it, honest work. The mountains are blue in the morning, and the air tastes clean. Some debts can't be repaid, only pass forward. Don't look back. JT." She read it twice, then once more, her thumb tracing the initials. JT. A name, finally, though it came too late for thanking. The paper trembled in her hands like a living thing, and she thought about all the ways a person could save another, with bullets, with bandages, with 10 silver dollars that cost everything. "He rode out on a bay mare," Samuel said quietly, watching her fold the note with the reverence it deserved. "Heading into sunrise. Man like that, riding toward something or away from it. Hard to say which." Sarah tucked the paper against her breast, beneath the thin cotton of her dress where it would stay warm. She understood, now, the language of leaving, how some gifts were too heavy to give face to face, how gratitude could choke a person worse than desert dust. He'd known she would come looking, had trusted Samuel to point the way, had left his message where only she would think to search. The sun climbed higher, painting perdition in shades of gold and shadow. Soon the town would wake, and Lucille would discover the money on her nightstand, the empty room, the contract's chains finally broken. But for now, there was only this moment, Sarah standing at the edge of decision, holding directions to a different life written in a stranger's careful hand. "There's a stage comes through at noon," Samuel offered, returning to his hay fork. "Goes as far as Santa Fe, if a person had cause to travel." She nodded, though he'd already turned away, granting her the privacy of choice. The water in the trough reflected the morning sky, endless and blue as possibility. Somewhere past Eagle Rock, an old man rode west on a horse paid for with paper money, lighter now without his mule, but heavier with the knowledge of what those $10 had purchased. Sarah turned from the stable and walked back into town, her steps firm with new purpose. The flour sack on her shoulder held everything she owned, but the paper against her heart held everything she might become. She thought about mountains blue in the morning, about air that tasted clean, about debts that could only be passed forward like sacred things. Behind her, the hoof prints in the dust were already beginning to fade, claimed by the wind that swept down from the desert. But some marks, she was learning, were made on things more lasting than earth. Some gifts carved themselves into the soul's geography, changing the shape of every sunrise that followed. At the stage depot, she would buy a ticket with money earned from a mule sacrifice. She would ride toward mountains she'd never seen, carrying a stranger's kindness like a compass pointing true. And maybe someday, when she'd learned the taste of clean air and honest work, she would find someone else wearing chains that needed breaking. The language of leaving, she understood now, was written in the space between words, in what wasn't said, what wasn't asked, what wasn't owed. It was a grammar of absence that spoke louder than gratitude, a syntax of silence that honored both giver and gift. Somewhere, a man named J.T. rode toward his own horizon, probably never looking back to see if his message had been found. The schoolhouse in Santa Fe stood like a promise kept, its adobe walls the color of dried blood in the afternoon light. Sarah moved between the rows of desks, her boots clicking against the wooden floor in a rhythm she'd come to know like her own heartbeat. 6 months of teaching children to shape letters, to find meaning in marks on slate, while the note from J.T. lived in her dresser drawer like an unquiet ghost. Outside the window, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains wore their October snow like vestments, just as blue in the morning as he'd promised. The children bent over their primers, tongues caught between teeth in concentration, and she watched them with the strange distance of someone living a borrowed life. Their innocence was a foreign country she could visit but never inhabit, their easy trust a language she was still learning to speak. "Miss Sarah?" Maria, the smallest one, held up her slate. "Is this how you write grateful?" The word sat there crooked but earnest, each letter a small victory against ignorance. Sarah knelt beside the child's desk, her skirts pooling around her like spilled ink, and guided the small hand through the proper shapes. "Yes," she said softly, "that's just right." But the word lodged in her throat like a stone. Grateful. She'd written it herself 100 times, tried to send letters to perdition that always ended in the fire. How did you thank a ghost? How did you repay a debt to someone who'd asked for no payment? The gratitude sat in her chest like an unwanted guest, growing heavier with each clean morning, each honest dollar earned. Marcus had been true to JT's word, had given her work in a room above the kitchen without questions, his war debt paid in silence. The other teachers thought her merely mysterious, a young woman from somewhere east who'd come for her health. They didn't know about Lucille's perfumed rooms, about the weight of 10 silver dollars, about the careful letters of a man who'd traded his tomorrow for hers. The day's lesson ended with the ringing of the church bell, children scattering like startled birds into the afternoon sun. Sarah stayed behind, erasing the board with methodical strokes, each sweep of the cloth removing words, but not the weight beneath them. She'd built a life here out of another man's sacrifice, and it fit her like a dress made for someone else. Functional but foreign, protection that chafed. She was locking the schoolhouse door when Marcus appeared, his face carrying the kind of careful neutrality that meant bad news. He held a folded newspaper like it might bite, his knuckles white against the newsprint. "Thought you should see this," he said, voice low. "Know you came from Perdition Way." The paper was 3 days old, from Amarillo. She read the small notice twice before the words would settle into meaning. Unknown drifter shot in dispute over cards. Found with $10 and bill of sale for mule. No identification. Buried in Potter's Field. The key fell from her nerveless fingers, ringing against the stone step like a bell tolling. $10. A bill of sale. The mathematics of sacrifice completing its cruel equation. She saw him again in that moment. Pale eyes like still water, hands that shook as they counted out coins, a voice saying a mule's name like a prayer. "You knew him?" Marcus asked, though it wasn't really a question. "He gave me his life." The words came out broken, inadequate. "I never even knew his name. Just initials." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then war taught me that sometimes the not knowing is part of the gift. Makes it harder to refuse. That night, Sarah sat in her room above the kitchen, JT's note spread before her on the small table. The lamplight made the careful letters swim, or maybe that was her eyes. She'd thought she was living the life he'd bought her, but now she understood the deeper truth. She'd been hiding in it, using his gift as a wall between herself and the world that had shaped her. The borrowed horse waited in the stable, saddled with supplies she'd bought with her teaching wages. Amarillo lay 3 days east, through country that killed the careless and the kind with equal appetite. A woman traveling alone was a question begging for the wrong answer, but some debts demanded payment regardless of cost. She folded the note carefully, tucked it back against her heart where it had lived that first day. Her few possessions fit easily into saddlebags. She'd learned to travel light, to own nothing that couldn't be left behind. The children would find another teacher, one who belonged in their clean world of primers and slate boards. Marcus would understand, or he wouldn't. The war had taught him about debts too. The stars were sharp as accusations when she led the horse from the stable, their light cold on her face. Somewhere in Amarillo, a man lay in unmarked ground, his name lost to everyone but the God who counted sparrows. She couldn't change that, but she could stand at his grave, could speak his initials to the wind, could finally say the thank you that had been choking her for 6 months. Freedom, she was learning, wasn't the absence of chains. It was choosing which ones to forge for yourself. The gratitude that had imprisoned her in Santa Fe would drive her across the desert, toward a potter's field and a reckoning with the true cost of gifts given in silence. She mounted the horse with the ease of someone remembering an older self, turned its head toward the eastern stars. Behind her, the schoolhouse stood empty, tomorrow's lessons unwritten on its clean board. Ahead, the trail stretched into darkness. Every hoofbeat a word in the language of leaving she was finally learning to speak. Some chains, she understood now, were meant to be carried. Some freedoms cost more than $10, more than a mule, more than a life traded in a smoky saloon. They cost the courage to face the gift and the grief together, to name the unnamed, to honor the graves of strangers who'd chosen to be angels. The horse moved into the night with steady purpose, carrying her toward Amarillo and whatever lay beyond the marking of an unmarked grave. The potter's field in Amarillo had been empty of everything but wind and unmarked wooden crosses, the gravedigger unable to say which mound held which forgotten soul. Sarah had knelt in that dust for hours, speaking her gratitude to all of them, just to be sure. But when she'd returned to the boarding house, the clerk had laughed at her tears. "That notice? From last year, miss. Paper got the date wrong. Besides, drifter they found had dark hair, young. No bill of sale neither, just the coins." 3 weeks of searching followed, through towns that barely deserved names, following rumors of an old man who traded work for nothing, who fixed what was broken and moved on before thanks could find him. The trail led to Esperanza, a town the drought had turned to bone, where even the cemetery had given up accepting new residents. She found him by the sound of iron on stone, the rhythmic clang echoing through the still air like a heartbeat. Behind the widow Martinez's house, a figure worked in a hole deep as a grave, shoulders bent to the task of breaking through hardpan to reach the water below. His shirt lay folded on a rock, and she could see new scars across his back, a map of some violence survived since perdition. Sarah stood at the edge of the excavation, watching him work. The same weathered hands that had counted out 10 silver dollars now wielded a pickaxe with steady determination, breaking stone that didn't want to yield. His hair had gone whiter, his frame thinner, but she knew him by the careful way he moved, the reverence he brought to simple labor. "Water's down there," the widow said, appearing beside Sarah with a tin cup. "He says he can taste it in the dust. Won't take no payment except meals. Been here 2 weeks now, digging wells for folks who can't afford the professional crews." The sun was falling toward the horizon, painting everything the color of old blood and promises. Sarah took the cup from the widow, filled it from the barrel by the door, and waited. When he finally climbed from the hole, dirt-caked and weary, he saw her standing there and went still as a deer scenting danger. Time stretched between them like a hell breath. She saw recognition flicker in his pale eyes, saw him measure the distance to his shirt, to the road, to escape. But she moved first, slow and careful, extending the cup like an offering. He took it with hands that trembled more than she remembered, drank deep, his throat working against the water like it was salvation. When he lowered the cup, she saw the question in his eyes. How had she found him? Why had she come? What debt was she trying to pay? "I went to Amarillo," she said softly. "Thought you were dead." Something shifted in his face, a kind of rueful acceptance. He refilled the cup from the barrel, handed it to her. The water was warm, tasted of metal and earth, but she drank it like communion wine. They stood there as the sun touched the horizon, passing the cup between them, sharing water in a drought-struck town while the silence said everything words couldn't hold. "I teach school now," she offered finally, "in Santa Fe. The children call me Miss Sarah." He nodded slowly, like this was right and proper, like he'd known all along what she'd become with his 10 silver dollars. His hand went to his pocket, an old gesture, and she knew he was feeling for coins that weren't there anymore, that had been transformed into something larger than currency. "I want to repay you," she said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "What you did, you already have." The words came out rough and used. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw in his eyes not the expectation of gratitude, but something else entirely, a kind of completion like watching a seed finally break through to sunlight. He gestured toward the town, the dry wells, the widow's house. "You taught children their letters. That's payment enough." Sarah felt tears threaten, hot and unwanted. "That's not. I need to," but he was already turning away, lowering himself back into the hole, taking up his pickaxe like a man returning to prayer. She understood, then, that some debts couldn't be settled with money or words or even gratitude. They could only be honored by living forward, by passing the gift along like water in a drought, one cup at a time. The widow touched her arm gently. "He'll work until full dark. Always does. You're welcome to stay for supper." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the stone in her throat. She stayed by the well as shadows grew long, watching him dig toward water in a town dying of thirst. Sometimes he glanced up, and their eyes would meet, and in those moments she felt the full weight of what connected them. Not debt, but something deeper. The understanding that kindness was a chain that linked stranger to stranger, each act of grace creating the next, world without end. When darkness finally drove him from the hole, they ate beans and cornbread at the widow's table, 3 people brought together by drought and need and the strange mathematics of mercy. He spoke little, but his presence filled the room like a benediction. Sarah told them about her students, about mountains blue in the morning, about lives that could be rewritten with careful letters. Later, standing by his bedroll under the stars, she tried once more. Your mule. Rosalie. I could buy her back. He shook his head, the ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. She's got a new story now. Like you. The truth of it settled into her bones like dust. They were all just stories being written by hands they couldn't see, each chapter flowing into the next, connected by threads too fine to follow, but too strong to break. She'd come looking to settle a debt, but found instead a larger truth, that some gifts were meant to keep moving, passing from hand to hand like water in the desert. She left at first light, while he was already back in the hole, the sound of his pickaxe a rhythm like a heartbeat. The widow pressed a wrapped bundle of food into her hands, payment for a debt she didn't owe. Sarah rode towards Santa Fe carrying new weight, not of obligation, but of understanding. Behind her, an old man dug toward water for people who couldn't pay, each strike of metal on stone a prayer for rain that might never come. Some wells, she was learning, were dug not for water, but for hope.